Hi everyone, Nicholas Matovich here for another YouTube video. I've been reading a lot of books on railroad safety and also other random books in general. I mean, most of the books that I've been reading and some of the titles I come up with are purely, most of them is going to be 50-50. Then one of them is going to be purely fictional, the other one's going to be purely non-fictional, and everything's going to be everything else in between. Most of these copies are like maybe $16, and you can find them anywhere all over eBay, Amazon, or some parts of the internet. But most of them will likely have like a 35% off if used, and they could be on sale depending on the condition of the covers of the books. Without further ado, I actually have a few books that I grew up. Remember, there is one book called Rather Outspoken. It's about the story of CBS News anchorman Dan Rather and his life in the state of Texas. Basically, it talks everything from the Watergate scandal of President Nixon's era to the 9/11 attacks to the what we call the hazing ritual. To be more specific, it's hazing ritual at Abu Ghraib prison. He's won Beth Oscars for 60 Minutes and 60 Minutes 2. He did a tremendous update on 48 Hours, Crack of Dawn, which basically is the real life story of basically what they call the cocaine cowboys in Miami, Florida, which is a cocaine enterprise ring for parts of Colombia, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and NITO, the treaty organizations that promote terrorism in Puerto Rico and Cuba. Those books are purely non-fictional, and they are one of the scariest. There are also crazy books like this one's called On the Front Lines, which is written by Bob Orr, who was a correspondent for Homeland Security for Washington for CBS at the time. He basically wrote the book about the lives and deaths and the decision makings of Muhammad Atta, who was the hijacker on American Airlines Flight 11. There's also more, and also Jim Stewart did some information, but there are other books that I would like to be very familiar with, like one called Mountain Logging Railroads, which is basically Cass Scenic in West Virginia. Basically, it'll tell you all about the details of every locomotive they had on the roster and the collection. It has some of the glossary and the index can go to the very rear of the pages, so we'll give you a good example of that. You have some books from like Jim Wren, Steam Camelot of the Steam program from 66 to 94, 25th anniversary in 1991. Everything's in there. The swamp derailment of 86, which under regulations of the FRA at the time, they banished all open air cars with no glass, with what they call the glassless windows. Those cars, well, one of them is called the Missionary Ridge, that was scrapped in the 80s. And there's also some crazy non-fictional stories called the Graveyard. It's Gardner's Graveyard, which is a very haunting story of the crown sheet failure of the Gettysburg Railroad, which was a very frightening story. From what I heard is that the engineer suffered highest was like he got to 4th and even 5th degree burns when he tried to jump out of the window, and he was just covered in water, coal dust, and flames. He was burned. Pretty much most of his body was just burned. 4th degree burns, mostly on his stomach and chest, were covered in 4th degree burns. So it was just frightening. He wasn't killed, but none of them, I believe, are living. They all passed away. Not related to the incident itself. There's also some other kamikaze books called The Mojave Mayhem, which is a very non-fictional book about the dangers of domestic violence. It was about the story of a gentleman named Zane Mason, who was accused of second-degree murder, originally for domestic violence, originally threatening to be sentenced to death, but because of the lack of family in his life, he got maybe 20 years to life in a federal prison in Arizona after making the unlawful flight to avoid prosecution to Sacramento, California. The victim was Gregory Zeller. His daughter woke up screaming the next morning and just saw her dad basically was disemboweled. I mean, he was like gutted, and he was cut up in pieces. Like, he was cut up. He was killed within seconds. And according to what John Walsh said, he was definitely the worst of the worst. So, there are also some other books that include, like, the history of locomotives and locomotive parts, and even got some old books from the old days, like Transportation Museum and the history of its collection as well. I also wanted to. I had 3 bestseller titles that are anonymous authors. They were all unknown at the time, but there was a few titles that were. It was basically both. Most of them were just. I had one fictional #1 hit, which was called. This was called the Atomic Fallout, which is a runaway freight train, 2 runaway freight trains carrying hazardous materials, and colliding at Dallas Curve in Georgia. There's also one called. This one's called the Clearwater Catastrophe, which took place of a runaway freight train which actually was in not British Columbia, but actual parts of Michigan as well. CSX heading from Michigan. That was a fictional title. And there's the non-fiction work, which included there's something called. Oh, it was definitely a promotion for Operation Lifesaver, and if I remember correctly, that title was Disobedience at Downers Grove. Disobedience at Downers Grove, which was a 1991 story about a woman named Mary Wotila who tried to beat a train at a crossing. She was a pedestrian and tried to run over the crossing, but the commuter train hit her at 70 miles an hour, and she was basically killed within 2 seconds after she was hit. So that was an unfortunate, but other frightening stories about Corruption on the Corridor, which is another non-fictional title about Ricky Lynn Gates, who is accused of manslaughter, sentenced to life on federal probation, federally prisoned, both state and the federal level, and afterwards he was completely written off the list, was fired from all the FRA, and he has a conviction, and you cannot at the time you're not allowed. So, but my final title was a crazy book, which was called. This was a scary book. It was called the vacuum at something called the St. Paul setback, and that's a Richard Vitek. Waited 3 hours for him to be rescued. He was actually asphyxiated and he suffocated from the lack of oxygen, and he quit his job at the railroads when he found the injuries were just too much, and the fear of getting run over was just too great. So, glad that's done. So, if you hope to hear from me soon, be sure to subscribe And hopefully I will get back to you as soon as possible with the books. Okay, bye.